Hello, this is Noah Wisman with another video here. In this case, this video will be a book review of a book that I've recently finished reading, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, first published in 1968. This will be my review of the book, and it won't be as much of like a here's what I liked and here's what I didn't like as much as it will be a consideration of the ideas presented in the book, what I agreed with, what I would critique, and what I would connect it to in my own learning. So let's get started. So here are some of the covers that the book has been published under over the years. You can see the original cover on the left, a more modern cover in the middle, and then my own copy of the book on the right. That's a picture of it on top of my bed frame. I got the 50th anniversary edition, which came with some bells and whistles, an introduction, and some interviews with various thinkers. But I'll be focusing on the contents of the book itself in this review. So just to give a brief summary, if you're not familiar with the book, this book contains a critique of standard pedagogical approach and proposes a new approach to the way that we should teach people and educate people. It draws on the tradition of critical and continental philosophy, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, but that includes the likes of Hegel and Marx and Heidegger and Husserl. I believe they all will be mentioned later as well. It also draws on social and political analysis done by Freire and various examples from the politics of the time and also his own experiences. Speaking of which, he also draws on his personal experiences as an educator in Brazil, which we'll talk more about as well. The overall point of the book, if I could put it just into one sentence, and we're going to be oversimplifying here a bit, we'll talk more about the points in detail later. But the overall point is that the standard, what we would colloquially refer to as lecturing approach to teaching, is dehumanizing, regardless of what the intent or the content of that lecturing approach might be. And that a humanizing approach, an approach which is not dehumanizing, but in fact helps people to become more human, must be dialectic, it must involve a dialogue, a conversation between people, it must be free, and it must be led by the oppressed. And if you want to transform society, you must transform education. And you can say it the other way around as well. You must transform education if you want to transform society. This is, of course, getting into that sort of Marxist influence of the book, this idea that if you want to bring about the revolution, the revolution in consciousness, you'll need to do it by changing the way people are taught. And this leads to the sort of overall concept of critical pedagogy, which is still very influential today, and which Freire founded, largely through this book and then his subsequent writings. My overall impressions of the book, again, not getting into anything too specific, but just, from reading it, here's what I felt that it had, was that, first of all, it's a very passionate and righteous book. You can tell that Freire cares about what he's writing about, that he wants you to understand what he's saying and get something out of it. This is definitely not a ponderer's book. It's not an armchair kind of book. It's a book that wants you to go out and do something after you read it, that is calling on you to go and do something after you read it. There's also, and I would want to talk more about this, but I'm only going to mention it briefly here because I'd have to go more line by line to demonstrate this, but there's a very clear Christian and Catholic influence kind of spread throughout the book. Freire was raised Catholic and continued to practice the Catholic faith throughout his life. And you can feel it in the way that the book is written, the terminology that the book uses, the way that it structured its ideas with the idea of like salvation and the ability to be reborn and things like this being conceptual themes in it as well. And it did remind me of Hegel, who was also a religious person and who also clearly had that inform his, nominally uh, secular philosophy. The book is also somewhat repetitive, not necessarily in a bad way per se, but ideas are certainly recapitulated. If you're familiar with that term from music and composition, where the same basic idea is said in multiple contexts and restated with multiple examples. And this I find is somewhat typical of writing that comes from this philosophical tradition. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, you get multiple angles on the same subject, but you'll definitely have that sensation of, well, I feel like I've heard this before a chapter ago when you're reading the book, and it's a question of, are we adding something new every time? And I think the answer is generally yes. Again, my feeling was that a lot of the analysis in the book agrees with my personal experience, that a lot of what Freire is talking about in terms of the relations between people and the ways that people exert power over one another and what that does to people in their interactions, all of that sort of was in alignment with my personal experience of how people tend to behave and act, which we'll definitely talk about more later. And in general, my takeaway in terms of a positional standpoint at the end of the book is that it was very thought-provoking. There's a lot of good ideas that I agreed with, that I'm going to take with me, and that I was happy to be exposed to and to come to some understanding of. But I wouldn't call myself a full convert to the perspective of critical pedagogy. I know that some people who read this book are like, well, critical pedagogy, that's going to be my thing, that's my perspective, that's what I'm adopting, I'm a critical pedagogist. I wouldn't say any of that. I think that I was exposed to some of the ideas that the book goes over before reading this book through philosophical and educational psychology backgrounds that I have. But because of that, I wasn't as taken by this book, and I do have some criticisms of it. With that said, I do think it was a great read, and I think I got a lot out of it. And certainly, even if I'm not fully converted, I'll be taking aspects of what Freire talks about and bringing them into the practice that I have. So here is a picture of Freire relatively early on in his life. Just to give a quick bio, he was born in 1921 in Brazil to a poor family in a poor neighborhood. And Brazil in the 1920s and 30s, and for quite a long time, was a kind of semi-feudal state where if you lived in the city and you owned land, then you'd be well educated and you'd be in sort of the elite class. And if you lived in the countryside and you did not own land, then you would live like a peasant and you would till the land and not really get much of an education. And there's a really strong class divide in Brazil, especially in the 20s and 30s when Freire was born and was growing up. There was beginning to be changes in this going into the 40s and 50s and 60s, and Freire found himself, once he was able to get an education, sort of endorsed by the political structure, which was left-leaning at the time and wanted change and progress. So he worked for the government in various projects trying to improve literacy amongst the field-working peasant class until 1964, and we'll talk about what happened in 1964 soon. So here's a picture of him teaching. See him here sitting on the chair here. And I really like this picture. We're probably going to call back to it later because I feel that it showcases what critical pedagogy is in a way that does not need words. You can use a lot of words to describe something, but there's a different experience when you see it. And to me, this, sitting in this circle, everyone at about the same level, Freire really looking at what the student is doing and taking it seriously and taking an interest in it, reaching his hands out to receive it. This, to me, is a really good example of what critical pedagogy is supposed to mean, and we'll be referring back to this later, as I mentioned. Okay, so what went wrong in 1964? I mentioned we would cover it shortly. So in 1964, there was a coup, and the left-leaning, sort of socialist, communist-leaning government was ousted by a military dictatorship, which was in power from 1964 to 1985. And of course, the United States backed this dictatorship. It was a classic Red Scare kind of situation. They'd support anybody who wasn't communist. And Fieri, who was left-leaning and espoused all kinds of, Marxist influenced ideas, was first arrested and then exiled, and was forced to live abroad. And he wrote the book, which I'm reviewing today, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, during that time period when he was in the United States. Here's a picture of some tanks moving into the square in, I believe, Sao Paulo. So in throughout the entire, I should say, reign of the military dictatorship, there were protests. There were protests all the way through it, and they really gained steam in the 1980s. And in 1980, Freire moved back to Brazil, and he campaigned against the regime, and he campaigned for to have positions in the public office. And in 1985, the military regime was deposed, and Freire was accepted back into public life in Brazil, and he sort of spent the rest of his life there. I think he was happy to be back. And here's one of the many demonstrations that took place contra a dictatoria, I believe. And here he is in his elder years. Again, he was endorsed by the new government. He was able to teach again and write again freely in his home country. And then he was made the Secretary of Education in 1988, and that was sort of his last major position. And he would go on writing and speaking and teaching throughout that time. So as I mentioned before, Pedagogy of the Oppressed was first published in 1968 while Freire was in exile. And then the English translation was published in 1970, and the Portuguese translation, or rather the original text, was finally published in 1972. Here's the original cover, which I showed before. Wikipedia refers to the book as a Marxist class analysis of the relationship between colonizer and colonized, which I think is reductive and I don't think is particularly accurate. It's very clearly a book that was influenced by the entire continental philosophic tradition up to that date, rather than just Karl Marx and Frederick Engels and sort of that class of writings. But for sure, the book has sold over 750,000 copies worldwide and is the third most cited book in social science. Is definitely accurate. If we go to the Google Scholar page for Pedagogy of the Oppressed, we can see it has over 130,000 citations, which is a lot of citations. That's really impressive, just from an academic impact standpoint. And it also had an impact on the public and on teaching practice in a way that not every academic publication has. And I think you can attribute at least some of that to it hitting at the right time in the 1970s. This was famously a time of a lot of social and political upheaval in the United States and around the world, and I think people were ready for a book that asked them to take another look at education and what education is really all about. So that's the environment that the book was published into. Okay. So now we get into where I enter this picture. So I picked up my copy of this book in a bookstore in the Bay Area. Not this bookstore specifically, but I think this should give you the kind of vibe of the place I was in. I just saw it sitting on the shelf. It was like right towards one of the bottom shelves, and I recognized the title. And I'm not sure where I recognized it from. I know I've heard of this book before at some point, but I couldn't tell you exactly from where. I knew I was interested in it, so I picked it out. got the book and started reading. Okay. And then a little bit of background about me. I may have mentioned this before, but um, I came into this book with um, some knowledge that was very relevant to my reading of it, and I think very helpful to my reading of it and understanding what it was getting at. For starters, I'm a major in educational psychology at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I'm also teaching at Hunter College currently. I'm teaching statistics for psychology, and the experiences of having been a teacher in a certain context and of learning about theoretical perspectives on teaching, I definitely brought into my reading of this book. For example, I would note that a lot of the ideas in this book have overlap with specifically the educational psychologist and developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who himself was also influenced by Marx's writings in the way that he construed his psychological theory. Um, and in that vein also has a lot of overlap with situated and sociocultural perspectives in psychology, many of which stem from Vygotsky's own writing. Here's a picture of Anne Brown, who's a sort of socioculturally influenced researcher who has been a huge influence on my own thinking, as well as Jerome Bruner in this picture next to her. I rather like this picture because it reminds me a lot of the picture of Freire teaching. That same kind of interest in what the student is doing. And it also has a lot of overlap with situated perspectives, situated learning, Jean Lave and Etienne Wegner being the sort of founding members of that movement, whose work I'm also pretty familiar with. Also influential to my reading of this book was my familiarity with the critical continental philosophy tradition. Hegel, Marx, Heidegger, Husserl, Sartre, they all are cited in this book, they're all referenced in this book, and you can definitely feel the influence of their ideas on this book. In particular, Hegel I think is very influential, Marx is definitely very influential, and then from the more modern continental philosophers, Heidegger, Husserl, and Sartre, you get this sense of like individualism and the value of the individual and the definition of each individual's place in the larger society. And I'd like to here take a moment to shout out a YouTube channel which I've been watching quite a bit of to get familiar with some of these thinkers who I hadn't known as much about before. This is Michael Suguri, I believe is how you pronounce his last name, who's posted some old lectures that he gave back in the day about these philosophers, and I like that channel quite a bit. Give it a look if you haven't already. Okay. So I'm going to talk about my takeaways from this book in 4 different categories. First of all, things that I agreed with and that resonated with me. Critiques that I have, points of disagreement with the book, some questions that I have, many of which are somewhat critical in their overall tone. These are questions I feel were unanswered that probably need an answer. And then my general takeaways, what am I, from this book, what am I bringing with me into my future research and practice? So we'll just go one by one. So first of all, I think like the number one source of agreement and that one of the better ideas that I felt I was exposed to in this book is the idea of education as being a process of becoming more human. And the term that Freire used, and I'm about to butcher this Portuguese right now, is conscientização. And he sort of refuses to translate it. It reminded me a lot of Hegel's Geist, which also doesn't really get translated, and also Dasein from Heidegger. And it clearly shares some philosophical roots with those ideas, but is a little more focused on the immediate, concrete sense, as opposed to the Geist, which is a very sort of abstract, out there kind of concept. Freire thought that the way that you pursue this ideal is to understand your political, your economic, and your cultural situation, the specific situation that you find yourself in. and the way you relate to the power structure that you live in. This is a sort of Marxist influence for sure, which makes it a much more local idea than, say, the Geist or Dasein, which are more sort of heady ideas. And I definitely find a lot of sympathy with this perspective, this idea that the goal of education and that the practice of education should be in alignment with helping students to become more fully human. They are human, of course, but they need to more fully realize their humanity, their ongoing and never-ending projects. I like that idea a lot. Also agreed with the issues that Freire brings up with this idea of banking education, this idea that what education should be is that the teacher who knows and who has the correct answers goes and places that information like a deposit in a bank into the student who retains that information, that this is fundamentally wrong. I came into this reading knowing the term industrialized education, which is a very similar concept and probably has the same roots as the idea of banking education. Um, but I knew these concepts more in the term of effectiveness, that when you try to teach people in this depositing kind of way, in this factory line kind of way, that they don't really learn. They forget what you tell them almost immediately, and it certainly doesn't affect the way that they see the world. Freire makes more of a moral and societal point, and this is a consistent theme that I identified reading this book, is that I would have some familiarity with the concept he was talking about, but in the concept, in the not concept of, but the context of why that practice is bad from like a practical standpoint, from the standpoint of how much the person you're teaching is actually going to learn of what you tell them, not as much from a moral or a societal point, from the idea of, is this going to help the person you're teaching become a good person or not, or a better person, or a more human human. So here's a diagram that I got from one of the research papers I've read, which is talking about the difference between didactic learning and collaborative learning, somewhat similar to what Freire is talking about, but in educational psychology terms. Here, the instructor tries to insert learning into the learner from their own head into the head of the other, whereas here, the people involved in the learning process share in their learning and do it together and build it together. This, again, is the kind of distinction that Freire is talking about, but here the emphasis of this paper is on which style of teaching is more effective for the actual construction of new knowledge, whereas Freire is talking about which one of these is more effective for the construction of a more conscious human, somebody who understands their own position in society and is capable of critiquing their own position in society more effectively. So again, it's that same conclusion being reached, but with two different motivations or goals, which are overlapping. I do think that these are not in any way at odds with one another. I think they're confluent in the sense that the reason people don't learn what you're trying to teach them when you try to bank it in their head is because you're not treating them like a full human. And the reason why they learn better when you learn together in a dialogic kind of way is because you are treating them like a full human. And so these things are not mutually exclusive. I think they're complementary. Okay. Another thing that I agree a lot with, and it's very closely related to the previous point, is the importance of doing and learning with students. And in fact, dissolving the distinction overall between the teacher and the learner, the teacher and the student, accepting the fact that we are all always learning, and we're doing it when we're at our best, we're doing it together. I mentioned I'd be showing this picture again, and I think that this picture is a good representation of what this means, that Freire might ostensibly be the teacher of this class, but he's just as ready to learn about whatever he can from the supposed students. The idea that everyone brings a legitimate perspective to the table, their own expertise to the table, and that we are better off in sharing and building a collective understanding than we are in one person trying to determine what all the right answers are for everybody else. This is something that, again, I believed coming into this book and has always influenced my own practice as an educator. I try not to see myself as being above the people who are in my class. Okay. This, I think, is a strong point, and I'll probably be coming back to it as well. Fidetti makes a great point, which is that if you teach didactically, if you teach in this like banking style where you're trying to just plant correct ideas into somebody's head, then no matter what it is that you're teaching, you are fundamentally being propagandistic. And even if what you're teaching is, in terms of its content, progressive, the fact that you are teaching it in a way that's not a conversation, but that's a one-way street, will make what you're teaching propagandistic. And that if you believe that people need to be critical and need to think for themselves, need to be conscious, and they need to analyze what they take in at further depth than what they're being shown immediately, then you have to teach that way. In essence, you have to practice what you preach. You need to teach them through a dialogue. You need to teach them through a critical analysis. You need to teach with them and learn with them. If you are saying, hey, you need to learn how to think critically, but you're doing it as a lecture with a series of slides, it's not going to work. They're going to learn by what you do, not by what you say. He makes an analogy throughout the book with charity, this idea that if you hand out resources to people, they become reliant on you. They cannot stand on their own 2 feet. It's a very teach a man to fish versus give a man a fish kind of concept. And education certainly works this way as well. Again, to give a kind of real-world example of something that I think fits into this and falls into this, it's a common complaint amongst educators in New York City. I can only speak for New York City, although I believe this is a problem in other places as well, that the government will have these teaching practices that they want teachers to implement in schools. And so, for example, that might be something like modeling expecting behaviors, leading students through behaviors, tests to understand that students understand the behavior, these kind of practice and role play activities where, again, the teacher and the students are learning together and there's modeling going on and there's collaborative learning going on. New York City, New York State wants teachers to bring these practices into the classroom, but the way that the government tries to get people to implement these collaborative, modeling, learn together, social sort of teaching practices to be implemented in the classroom is by sending out a big PDF to everybody, to all the teachers, and being like, now implement this. How am I going to implement it? Can you give me an example of how to implement it? Can somebody lead me through a session where we together kind of learn how to implement this? No. Here's a PDF, figure out how to do it. How is the teacher in that situation supposed to take your statement about your desire seriously and actually implement it? Clearly, you don't really believe that the teacher deserves to be taught in the way that you're asking them to teach others. And in fact, many of these programs end up falling at the wayside. People don't implement them, I think, precisely because they're not being treated with the respect and the humanity that they're being asked to treat other people with. Okay, another big source of agreement, the idea that to teach, you must teach dialectically, as we've been discussing. We must teach with each other and in conversation through historically relevant situated objects. Now, this is a term that if you're not already familiar with some of these concepts might seem a little bit dense. I was already familiar with a lot of these concepts from learning about situated learning, which has a lot of these similar ideas. But, long and short of it is essentially that you can't teach people things in the abstract. people need to learn things through specific goals and situations and cultural practices that they experience in their real life and that have some kind of meaning to them. And that is what a historically relevant situated object would be. Um, Something that this made me think of was the practice of culturally relevant pedagogy, pioneered by Gloria Ladson-Billings, which I've done some reading on, which very much takes this idea and makes it into the center. I'm not sure if Ladson-Billings was directly influenced by Freire. I wouldn't be surprised. But she, for example, taught literary analysis to students by incorporating lyrics from rap songs, hip hop songs, elements of street culture, and mixing it in with some more traditional readings of social theorists and poets, and doing a critical analysis of those texts and showing how the same methodologies of critical analysis could be applied to all of those different texts and how they could be seen as being saying similar things. Very interesting program, and very much in that spirit of teaching through historically relevant situated objects, topics, literal objects, but also concepts that people have some kind of resonance with in their daily life is very important. Again, not just to how much they'll learn, which is how I tend to think about it as an educational psychologist, but also to their social and moral development, their Conscientisation. Okay. Another thing which I agreed with was an idea which Freire talks about, this dehumanizing effect of ownership and dependency, that when a person has, let's say, a lot of money and a lot of influence and they have political power and they exercise that political power over another person who lacks those resources and does not have political power, that not only is the person who is being put down in this hierarchy dehumanized, but also the person who's doing the putting down is dehumanizing themselves because they're acting tyrannically and they're denying the humanity of another person, and in doing so they're denying their own humanity, and they become inextricably linked to the narrative that they must build around themselves to justify their treatment of the other person. And this is very clearly being influenced by Hegel and Hegel's conception of the master and the slave dialectic, and the bondsman and the servant dialectic, also called. Of course, in Hegel's conception, the master is actually more oppressed than the slave, which I don't know if I agree with that. I think that's a little bit crazy. But both oppressed, I can get on board with that. And Freire definitely states that strongly in his book. He makes the point that the liberation of people not only liberates the oppressed, but also liberates the oppressor from their oppressive dynamic, which I think is really important. And he states that he makes the very clear point that it should be the people who are oppressed who lead the way out of this unhealthy dynamic. That the oppressed are in a better position to see what the problems are and find paths to solutions, whereas the oppressors are in a worse position and will find it harder to do so, and therefore should sort of invert that hierarchy and let people who are oppressed take the lead, and of course they can come along with. Mutual learning led by the oppressed. Again, we don't have a hierarchical classroom per se. All of which I think are really interesting and good points. Okay. So now some points of disagreement, and most of them are not nearly as fundamental as the points of agreement, but I think they're still relevant. The first issue I wanted to bring up with the book is that the book has a bit of a fancy talk issue, where the writing of the book is technical, there's a lot of terminology, it's dense, terms like, historically relevant situated objects are used very casually, and this is very common in the continental critical tradition. Heidegger is famously difficult. Hegel is famously difficult. Husserl is not very easy. Um, Marx is like maybe a little bit more approachable, but he's not a walk in the park either. Um, and this would not be a very substantive criticism. It's a stylistic criticism, but not necessarily a criticism of substance, except for the fact that Freire is, purportedly writing this book for the people, writing this book to influence the thoughts and the practice and the understanding of self of people who don't know terms like um, praxis and reification and things like that. I don't think he uses reification in the book, but that kind of idea. And again, it's a big problem in this tradition that there's a desire to be of the common person, but a difficulty in speaking the parlance of the common person. Now, I have no doubt that Freire was able to communicate these ideas with people who don't necessarily use this kind of language because he was able to successfully teach classes with those people and get a lot out of those experiences. But this book definitely has that issue, and one would like to see, and I believe these things exist, a version of these writings which make things less technical. I think that would be not just of convenient importance, but also of conceptual importance and of principled importance to this kind of a movement. The book also has a overgeneralization and categorization issue of social groups and roles, especially of defining a group as the oppressors, the oppressor, and people who are oppressors, and also, of course, then in the inversion of the oppressed and people who are oppressed. And again, this is a common issue in this tradition. Marx famously did this. I mean, he really divided people into classes and talked about the behavior that that class exhibits, exceptions be damned. And again, this is something that is not necessarily inherently wrong. There's a certain amount of overgeneralization you have to do to talk about any kind of principles about how people behave. People are individuals, they all behave a little bit differently, they all have different opinions. You must overgeneralize and oversimplify to talk about groups of people in any meaningful way. But of course in life, the difference between oppressor and oppressed is not so categorical. People are oppressed in certain circumstances and oppressors in other circumstances. It's more of a spectrum. It's situational. Intersectional perspectives on social analysis theory were, I think, still in their infancy when Freire wrote this book, and would come in and make these points not so long afterwards. This idea that people are multifaceted and that they are advantaged in one sense and disadvantaged in another sense. Of course, I would also add a temporality to those changes where the person who's oppressed at work might come home and be the oppressor at home, for example. And again, all of these things are normal issues to have with any kind of conversation that's like this, but they have a particular relevance to this book because Freire is going to make practical claims, give practical advice about who should have what position in the coming changes to pedagogy and the coming changes to society. And specifically, we go back to that claim that the oppressed should be the ones who are leading the conversation because they're going to have an easier time seeing what the problems are and make better insights about them. But once you make a claim like that, you have to ask, well, who are the oppressed? Who are the people who are going to be better at making those claims? And under what context and in which discussions is this person going to be better versus that person going to be better? Well, it's going to depend on who is the oppressed and who is the oppressor in the context which is being discussed and which is being lived. And this is why, from my own perspective, I would not worry as much about who the oppressor is and who the oppressed is in any given dialogue, in any given conversation, because then you get into this chopping up problem, this, the derogatory term is oppression Olympics problem, where people start to compete in like a political power sense about who is the most oppressed and therefore whose voice deserves to be the most elevated. And I think that from a pragmatic perspective, um, not getting bogged down in those problems is the best way to go. And just saying, like, look, let's hear everybody's idea and let's figure out which ones are the best ideas based on what resonates the most about this topic and situation. Um, so again, that overgeneralization has pragmatic implications for the theory and the approach that Freire is proposing, and may not have elegant solutions. Okay, this is another common issue. A lot of the issues in this book are common to the entire philosophical tradition that is inspiring this book. Um, Again, this is a particular problem with um, with Marx and with the various social theories that spring out from him, which is that if you don't agree with them, if you have some critique of them, you don't think their conclusions are right, you think that they're taking something too far, well, the reason you think that is because you're indoctrinated by the system, the oppressive system, which you are a member of. You're probably defending your class interest. That's why you don't support the revolution. That's why you don't support these political changes. It's because you're just looking out for number one and for the group that you represent. And this is not necessarily wrong per se. I mean, these things do happen. People do assume positions because they are indoctrinated by their system and because they're defending their own class interests. But it has a tendency to sort of hand wave counter arguments. And when people raise concerns that are legitimate, that aren't based on indoctrination or defense of their own class interest, they tend to be washed aside all the same. And this this creates problems when you try to create a genuine dialogue, which again is one of the goals of this entire approach to pedagogy, is to create a genuine dialogue. So this is not necessarily a problem. Again, this book definitely had that leaning. It had various statements that lean in this direction of people who aren't on board because they're indoctrinated. But it's only a problem if it's a problem in practice. If in practice you're able to have those kinds of conversations and parse through what is a objection from indoctrination and what is a genuine objection, then there's no problem. But it's a possible issue then, potential source of disagreement. Okay. Oh yes, and then sorry, drink some water there. So another major issue, and it's again a very common issue in the Marxist influence tradition, especially in this era of human history, the like 50s, 60s, 70s, is that the book has a number of endorsements of people like Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Vargas, Lenin, all these sort of communist red bloc political leaders. Their writings are cited. Freire raises them as examples of how to do things right, how to lead a revolution the right way. He especially cites Mao quite a bit. And regardless of how complicit you think these various political leaders were in the respective tragedies that befell their nations, it should be evident, again, however much blame you think they deserve, it should be evident that they were propagandists. They were not really leading movements that were of the people, by the people, and for the people. Maybe Lenin, like in the beginning, but certainly not by the time the state was established, and certainly not Mao, Fidel, or Vargas. They were all people who put up billboards, who took podiums, and who told people what they should think. And we can say that this is 2020 hindsight. This is our ability to see history from the present perspective. But I think that these things should have been clear by the late 60s when this book was published. Mao's Cultural Revolution had already been in full swing and was already known to the West at this time. And again, leaving aside the graveyards that are full of innocent people who were affected by that policy, um, even if we just take it from an educational perspective, um, the way that people are being taught in this system is not collective. Mao is standing over them metaphorically, but of course he would also literally stand on podiums over people, but in this case it's a picture of him, and they are reading and repeating what they're supposed to say. This is banking education. This is didactic. This is, say what I said because I told you to say it, and it's what's right. This is not sitting down next to people and learning with them. That's not how Mao ran his education system. That's not how Fidel ran his education system. It's not how Vargas ran his political campaigns. And it's really not how Lenin operated, although I guess that's the most defensible one. But he had posters too. He had slogans too. And the entire point of, this idea here that if you teach didactically, you replace one propaganda with another, is that it doesn't matter whose poster it is and how flowery that language is and how progressive that writing appears to be. If what you're doing is telling people to listen and repeat, then you're not leading a genuine revolution. And that should have been evident by the late 60s, and these people should have been criticized as false prophets, not elevated as great examples. Okay. This is a little bit more of a side note here. Not quite as on the central themes as the other stuff I'm talking about, but I think interesting nonetheless. One of the claims made in the book, and this is a claim that's, again, definitely influenced by like Heidegger and Hegel, is that what makes humans unique and what makes humans special is that we have culture and we have history, that we are historical beings, that different humans are different depending on the cultural events that led up to their own existence. However, it is not clear that this is something that separates us from all other animals. Some animals do have what you could consider to be culture. Dolphins, apes, and elephants all demonstrate skills and behaviors that are unique to their own herd, their own group, that are not practiced by members of their species that don't live with them and weren't raised with them. We may not be the only historical beings, although we certainly have the most elaborate and remembered history of any other animal. Here, of course, is a famous example of this, a chimpanzee using a stick to get ants out of a hole in a tree, which is a behavior that not all chimpanzees demonstrate. It's something that they have to learn from their parents and from the other members of their troop. It's not something that comes built in. It is, in that sense, a cultural practice. And you can debate whether or not this really counts as culture and cultural learning, and whether or not this means that chimpanzees are historical beings, but certainly is a debate which Freire in his book treats as having been settled, when I think it's very much open. And again, I believe Goodall had already done a lot of her pioneering research by this time, and he could have been aware of this and raised it as a point, but did not. So I think it's relevant to mention. Okay, and here's my last point in the disagreement section, which I think is an interesting point and requires a little bit of a recounting of the book in of itself. So we've been talking about a lot of the ideas that are present in the book, this idea that we need to learn together, that we need to dissolve the distinction between the teacher and the student, that the ones who are oppressed should lead the discussion, but that it should ultimately be a mutual discussion between all parties, and so on like this. And it would seem like this line of reasoning, this way of thinking about the relations between humans and how they should elevate each other, would lead you to the conclusion that the leaders that a revolution should not have people who are leaders. That they shouldn't have a revolution should not have people who hold political power and decision making authority. That instead, the revolution should be communal. It should come through the collective elevation of understanding between all people as they engage in their dialogues together. But in the sort of last chapter of the book, Freire kind of explicitly says, hey, I know it might seem like the revolution should not have leaders based on the things I've been saying, but the revolution should have leaders, and here's why. And the fourth chapter of the book is all about who those leaders should be, how they should behave. A lot of the conversation is about how they need to limit their own tendency towards taking control and taking command, and instead be the leader of the people, by the people, for the people. But I was always dogged by the question of like, well, why do we need the leader if the whole line of reasoning up to this point says we should be doing things together communally without elevating individual people to positions of power? Then why do we need these leaders who come from oppressed positions, who curtail their power, who are functionally just members of the community with a slightly elevated position? Well, why do we even need that at all? But he really holds on to that need. He holds on to the need for political leaders of the revolution. Of course, they should constrain their behaviors in many ways, but we do, he says, still need them. We need people like Mao, but like as a real Mao, not the Mao that Mao claimed to be. I think hopefully that made sense. We want someone who's authentically saying the things that Mao said, rather than pretending to believe those things. And this is going to be somewhat of a left field comparison here, reminded me a lot of the work of John Locke, and specifically the way he handled abolition, where if you read Locke's philosophy, he's like all about individual rights and about universal human morals and the social contract, and about how everything must be consented by the governed, all these kinds of ideas. And then he gets to the topic of slavery, and he's like, oh no, but slavery, we should keep that. And it's like, weren't you just talking about like freedom and like individual rights and limitations on power? Like, why now are you saying no, slavery? Slavery is okay. I'm against abolition. It seems like the whole logic of Locke's philosophy should lead you to abolition, to endorsing abolition as a principled thing for society to implement, but Locke stopped short of it. And it's theorized that this is for political reasons at the time, that the state of politics during Locke's day was such that you could not be an abolitionist, you couldn't denounce slavery without sort of committing political suicide. Too many powerful people would be too upset with you. And so Locke may have played a little bit of a game where he stopped short of the logical conclusion of his philosophy for politically salient reasons. And it feels like Freire might be doing a similar thing, although I don't think it's a political move the way that you could claim that Locke's writing was a political move, but just that he accepts the paradigm as it stands, the need for leaders and revolutions, and just comes right up to saying we don't need leaders in the revolution, and stops short of it and says we need to retain some amount of that old perspective. So it's an interesting point. I certainly think that if you're going to implement all of these ideas over here in the agreement section, you have to come to the conclusion that a leaderless revolution is not only possible but ethical, and the way that things should be done. Okay. So now some questions. Again, these questions are not, they're critical questions. You can kind of put them in the disagreement category, but they're not things I strictly disagree with. I just would like to see more writing on them. The first major point I'll bring up is this idea of, is the purpose of education edification or transformation? Is it to make people into the people who they should be? Or is it to encourage people to challenge the preconceptions of who they should be? And these two things are overlapping with one another. They're not mutually exclusive, but they're sort of two ways of looking at the same problem. And it's not 100% clear to me which way Freire is looking at that question. On the one hand, a lot of the book is about how people need to critique their own place in society. They need to take a critical stance. They need to look at the structures that exist, the power structures, the class structures, the political structures, the social structures, and challenge them, and challenge their legitimacy, and create a revolution, create a reform, create a change in those structures. On the other hand, isn't the creation of a person who does that itself a form of the imposition of a structure, and essentially a form of edification of you should be like this, so become like this? Related to this, very closely related to this, is this idea of, if you have a revolutionary pedagogy, which is all about challenging the current structure and encouraging people to take critical stances towards the world around them, what do you do with that pedagogy once it's established? If you ever catch that car, you're chasing the car, you're the dog chasing the car, well, what are you going to do when you catch it? And you're in charge, and critical pedagogy is the default, the dominant way of teaching in a society. Are you still going to ask people to take a critical stance towards it? Haven't all the principles that you believe in been instantiated? How am I supposed to challenge those? We're already doing the right thing according to you, maybe. Are we supposed to then lock in the system and say we're doing things the right way, we don't need to change it anymore? Or are we supposed to engage in a kind of continuous re-revolution where we're always challenging the preconceptions of the society and reworking them? But if we do that, aren't we going to throw out a lot of the good work that we've already done by constantly turning it over? It's a classic question in not just education, although it is a classic question in education, but also just in the construction of society in general. It reminds me a lot of The Republic by Plato, and specifically the part where Plato, through Socrates, talks about his conception of the ideal society and about the roles that all people should have in society, and the gold and the silver and the bronze tiers and so on like this. And in Plato's mind, once you establish that system, that perfect society, you should lock it in. You should make sure that it never changes, it never warps again, because we're already doing things the right way. There's no point in bringing in new ideas or challenging those ideas. Everything is already the way it should be. All of those things are just distractions. They're harmful. They're just going to cause unnecessary chaos and destruction. So Plato is very clear on what he thinks the right thing to do is. But if you're going to take the stance that the right way to do things is to constantly be criticizing, challenging, and changing those things, it becomes much harder to answer what we should do once we get the good system into place. Very interesting. This is a little bit of a shorter question, but I think interesting one. Should an idea like this idea that true learning must be done through dialectics, through discussion, should this idea even be communicated in a book? Isn't a book a didactic form of instruction? Isn't this Freire telling me what I should think, and I just have to listen to him? I have no way to speak back to him. It's a book, and he passed away, Not only this, but books, you can write a book in a way that's conversational, that invites the person who's reading it to challenge what you're presenting and add their own ideas to it. And I don't feel like this book is written that way. I feel like this book is written like a manifesto. It's written like Freire, presenting his own ideas to you, and sure, you can criticize them. You don't have to accept everything he's saying at face value, but the book doesn't offer moments to do that. You need to decide to do that as a reader. So is this an idea that even should be a book? That's a question you can ask. I think the answer fundamentally is yes. I think that the book succeeds in a lot of ways. But you could definitely make this argument. I think it's an interesting thing to raise. Another potential criticism of the book, although some people may argue that this is a strength, is that Freire talks about a lot of these principles that he believes in and that he believes education should embody, but he only ever gives one example of a successful implementation of these principles. He talks about a class that he led where the way I thought about it, the terminology that I used for it as an educational psychologist, was that it was essentially a qualitative methods research group, community-based research group, where members of a community sort of analyze the practices of their own community by doing interviews and writing down what people were saying and journals and things like this, and then analyzed it to find the themes. And it just seemed like it was a qualitative, community-based qualitative research project, which certainly feels like the kind of thing that fits in with all of these principles and is a great way to implement them, but it is only one example. And I don't think that, for example, 5 and 6-year-olds would necessarily be able to participate in that same kind of educational practice, which begs the question, well, how do I teach 5 or 6-year-olds by embody these principles while I do it? Again, some people would argue that this is a strength, that the point is that Freire isn't prescribing to you what to do. He's telling you what kind of things you should be pursuing, and then it's up to you to figure out how to pursue those things in the context in which you're teaching. And I think there's a strong argument to be made in that case, but I do feel like a little bit more guidance, examples of what to do, what not to do, common mistakes, is the kind of thing that really should be provided in any one of these situations. And I think that there are other examples out there if you're looking for them, but there are definitely not a lot of them in the book itself. This is where my own training in educational psychology becomes relevant, I feel, in that it gives ideas of how one might actually incorporate these principles into a teaching practice. Okay. Here's another question, which is related to the first two questions, very much so. And that is, let's say I'm teaching a class that is like this, a class that is communal, in which the students are giving their own voices and we're building and understanding together, and someone in the class comes out and they're expressing oppressive ideas, and they're very fervently expressing these ideas. And they're like, there should be political power between people, and I should have that power, and I should get to tell people what to do, and they shouldn't be able to talk back to me, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. What do I do as the educator of this classroom? Do I shut him down? Do I tell that guy, no, you're wrong, you shouldn't be above other people, you shouldn't have power over other people? Do I tell him what he should think? Isn't that oppressive? Or do I let him continue to say these things, dominate the conversation? If ultimately I'm supposed to do whatever gets him to stop believing that, whether that's let him talk and let him wear himself out and then come back with other examples and counter arguments, or if that's shutting him down immediately, if what I'm ultimately supposed to do is to get him to stop believing that, isn't that in some senses oppressive in of itself? Isn't that restrictive? People have to be able to come to incorrect conclusions if a classroom is truly to be free, or else there's only the illusion of choice. It's just propaganda with more steps in between. If there's an ultimate conclusion which all paths in the classroom must lead to, then we might as well have just cut out all that middle stuff and propagandized right to them, told them this is what is acceptable to think right at the beginning. It's the illusion of choice. It's a classic, religious question that is related to this idea that, you know, if we're going to have free will, we have to be able to choose to do the bad thing. And if we can't choose to do the bad thing, then we don't really have free will. That's, what supposedly makes us uniquely moral, uniquely human. There's a similar principle going on here. If we're going to have a truly free classroom, people have to be able to choose to come to the wrong conclusions, or else it's only a supposedly free classroom. Ultimately, there is a right answer, and you have to give it. Okay. Don't have answers for these things, that's why they're questions. But I think they're interesting to think about. And now for some general takeaways. Again, one of the big themes that I've mentioned before that I brought with me to the book and came out of the book with is this idea of the agreement between situated and sociocultural educational psychology research, but whereas that research is focused on how effective these things are at teaching people content of this topic or that topic, Fidelity is concerned with how these things are effective at improving people's moral and societal position, their ability to critique and understand their own place within that context. It's not just more effective at getting them to learn, it's the right thing to do. It's what will lead to a more human society. It's a very good point. Very interesting point. Another major takeaway from the reading is that good education is about behavior over content. It's about how people are engaging with the material. Again, you can make the content whatever you want it. If you teach it didactically, you're a propagandist. It's going to be propaganda. People are going to say it and repeat it but not know it. That you can have whatever historically relevant situated object you want. There's a wide variety of things that could fulfill that criteria. What matters is that it is historically relevant, that it is situated so that the way people engage with it is one that's a dialogue and that's interactive. That's what really matters. Again, related to this, the ability to differentiate dogmatic teaching from critical teaching, teaching that is about you repeat what I say because it's what's right to say, versus teaching that's about getting people to think for themselves. And about how even if nominally you're saying that you want people to think for themselves and be critical, if you don't teach them that way, then it doesn't matter. You're betraying your real beliefs through your practice. I thought this image was a good representation of this point. Here we have three different posters, three famous posters that are representing very different political positions and political beliefs. Classic Che Guevara sort of communist poster here, the one from Obama's presidential campaign, and of course the famous one which has been used in many feminist contexts. Again, the political and societal beliefs that each one of these posters represents is different, but the way that that belief is being communicated is the same in all three cases. There's a sense in which these are all, from a pedagogical perspective, these three things are all the same thing, even though the content that they are, at least supposedly, representing is different. They're all propaganda. They're all dogmatic. They're all a form of banking education, even though one might think that people who hold these beliefs would at least want to claim that that's not what they're doing, that they're encouraging a critical, class-conscious revolution. Well, maybe you're not encouraging people to be as critical as you think if the way you're trying to teach them is through propaganda. Very interesting. And then, again, another takeaway is a goal of education beyond quote-unquote job readiness or beyond quote-unquote knowledge about a specialty subject. And instead the goal of education being to becoming more fully human, engaging in a never terminating process of becoming more fully human. That is really the heart of education, and that job readiness, skill building, subject area expertise, those are only proxies for the real ultimate goal of education. which is human growth. Okay. So that concludes pretty much the bulk of my review for the book, the ideas that I noted and that I related to my own readings. I wanted to end on, again, relating to a lot of the themes that were just discussed, some more visuals, and what they might tell us. This is a poster that I found of Paulo Freire, and a quote from him: "Human existence cannot be silent." And I like this quote quite a bit. This idea that if you are going to be a human who exists, you cannot allow yourself to have your own ideas and not state them. To suppress your own ideas because you're afraid of stating that you can't have this. So I like this quote, but on the other hand, just take a look at this poster and think about what I demonstrated back here. I'll give an example of back here. And you'll see that this is kind of doing the same thing. It's another form of propagandistic communication. And I think that despite the fact that the person who made this presumably agrees with Paulo Freire, they've missed the point in the creation of this. Visually what's happening here is Paulo Freire is sort of lording over this larger group of people. He's saying something and they are all repeating what he's saying. They are following the marching orders. And to me, this is antithetical to what Freire actually believed in and actually represented. This is like, again, if we go back, this picture. The figure lording over and the people beneath that figure listening and repeating. Even if what they're repeating is supposedly revolutionary ideas. To me, this image represents Paulo Freire's beliefs much better. Not lording over people as a figure to be heeded and repeated, but sitting next to people as a mentor whose guidance you should engage with. Someone you should learn with while he's sitting next to you. Not repeat what he said standing over you. To me, this is the heart of critical pedagogy, Okay. So that's my book review. That's my review of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Again, very good read. A lot of takeaways from it that I really enjoyed. Wouldn't consider myself to be fully converted, but definitely highly sympathetic and interested to know more. And in the spirit of dialogue, as always, if you have any questions, go ahead, leave them, and I'll try to get to them. Okay. See you next one.